It's a sunny afternoon at Lake Sammamish outside Seattle. Families are out, friends are laughing, people are everywhere. And in that crowd, in broad daylight, a man approaches strangers and asks them for a small favour. Just help me carry something. Just walk with me for a minute. Hours later, 2 women are gone. No screaming, no chase, no dramatic scene. Just gone. And that's what makes this case so terrifying. It didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened where people felt safest, in public. This is Evil Uncovered. This is the full story of Ted Bundy. This documentary discusses sexual violence and murder. Viewer discretion advised. If you met Bundy in the early 1970s, you'd likely describe him in the way many people did back then. Smart, calm, organised. The responsible young man type. He studied at university, he pursued law, he was politically active around campaigns, around committees, around people who saw him as a future professional. Which sets up the first question we need to ask. How does someone like that become a predator? Here's the hard truth. You don't always see a transformation. Sometimes you're not watching someone become dangerous. You're watching someone get better at hiding it. Bundy didn't need to overpower an entire community. He just needed to look like a person the community would trust. And he worked at that carefully. To friends and colleagues, he seemed composed and polished. In relationships, he played the role of devoted partner, steady presence, the good guy. But the public version wasn't the whole picture. Because while he was building a normal life on the outside, something darker was tightening on the inside. And that brings us to the earliest cracks. Small, easy-to-miss fractures that later look painfully obvious. Bundy's origin story is complicated, and it mattered to him. He was born to a young mother, and for a time his family situation was wrapped in secrecy and confusion. Different accounts describe the details differently, but the core is consistent. Bundy grew up with a distorted version of his own identity, and later learned truths that destabilised him. Now, identity confusion doesn't create a killer, but in someone who already craves control, it becomes fuel. Resentment, shame, a constant need to prove superiority. As he grew, people remembered 2 things about him that don't sit comfortably together. He could be awkward, insecure, even socially disconnected. And 2, he could flip into a version of himself that was controlled and persuasive. That second version is the one most people met. And then there are the early behaviour reports. Voyeurism, boundary crossing, petty crimes. Again, none of these automatically equal murder, but they tell you something important. Bundy wasn't slipping. He was testing. Testing what he could do, testing what he could get away with, testing whether rules applied to him. Later, especially near the end of his life, Bundy tried to explain himself in ways that shifted blame outward. Compulsions, pornography, outside forces, even talking about a separate entity inside him. But here's the objective reality. Whatever he felt, he still made choices. And by the time the disappearances began, his choices had moved from fantasy to action. By 1974, the story wasn't about Ted Bundy. It was about missing women and a pattern nobody could quite grab yet. It starts like this. The name, one disappearance, one worried family, then another, then another. And the scariest part is how ordinary the circumstances were. Women vanishing from homes, from campuses, from routine afternoons. And because these cases happened across different areas, the biggest advantage the killer had was structural, separate jurisdictions. Separate police departments, separate files. Today we assume a serial offender can cross state lines. Back then, the speed of coordination wasn't what it is now. Then comes July 14, 1974, Lake Sammamish. Witnesses remember a man introducing himself as Ted. They remember him asking for help. They remember him appearing injured, like someone who needed assistance, not suspicion. 2 women disappeared that day, hours apart. The daylight detail matters, because it tells you he wasn't hunting in the shadows. He was hunting inside normal life. As weeks turned into months, the fear spread through communities. People changed routines, parents warned daughters, campuses felt different after dark, and Bundy kept moving. Washington, Oregon, then later Utah, then Colorado, Idaho. And behind each report was a life with a future cut off, not a case, a person. But the pattern still wasn't enough until one woman survived long enough to break it open. On November 8, 1974, Carol DaRonch, just 18 years old, was approached at a mall in Murray, Utah. The approach was calm, official sounding. He presented himself as law enforcement, and that's the trap. When someone speaks with authority, compliance can feel like the safe choice. Carol got into his vehicle, and then something felt wrong. When he tried to restrain her, she fought hard. Not movie fighting, real fighting. Panic, strength, survival. And she did the one thing that turns predators nervous. She refused to be controlled. Carol escaped. That escape wasn't just brave, it was critical, because it gave investigators something they didn't have enough of. A description, a vehicle link, a clear method, a living witness. From there, the net tightened. In 1975, Bundy was stopped by police, and the items found in his car raised immediate suspicion. Not long after, he was convicted for the kidnapping of Carol DaRonch and sentenced to prison. In a typical story, the threat ends there. But Bundy's case becomes infamous for a different reason. He didn't just commit crimes, he exploited systems. While facing additional charges, Bundy managed to gain access and movement through legal procedures, at times representing himself, placing himself in environments where security wasn't prepared for the kind of risk he was. Then, in June 1977, he escaped jumping from a courthouse window. He was recaptured days later, so you'd assume that would be the wake-up call. It wasn't. In late December 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time through patient planning and exploiting weak points in jail security. 2 escapes, 2 months where the system failed to contain a known predator. And after the second escape, the timeline gets darker, fast, because he wasn't just free, he was desperate. And desperate offenders escalate. Bundy travelled to Florida, and in January 1978, he attacked the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. An explosion of violence that left 2 women dead and others severely injured. This is the point where the Bundy myth often grows, where people obsess over performance, courtroom theatrics, appearance. But survivors have pushed back against that framing for decades, because it changes what people focus on. Not the harm, not the victims, the killer's persona. So let's be clear, this was not a clever man playing a dark game, this was a predator attacking sleeping students. Less than a month later, Bundy abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. The detail matters not for shock, but because it shows what escalation looks like, when the offender breaks even their own pattern because they're devolving. Then, February 1978, Bundy was arrested in Pensacola after a traffic stop in a stolen car. And now, the public didn't just want justice, they wanted to understand how this had gone on so long. Bundy's trial became a national spectacle, televised, heavily followed and soaked in attention. Bundy represented himself in part because controlling the room was the point. If he could speak, he could shape perception. If he could perform, he could distract. And for some people watching at home, it worked. But in the courtroom, performance doesn't erase facts. The prosecution built a case with multiple strands, eyewitness testimony and forensic arguments among them. One of the most famous forensic elements was the bite mark comparison testimony. At the time, it was treated as extremely persuasive by many jurors and viewers. But here's a modern caution that matters for true crime storytelling. Later scientific scrutiny has heavily criticised bite mark identification as unreliable, and today it's widely disputed. That doesn't mean there wasn't other evidence. It means we should be careful about turning any single forensic method into a magic bullet. Because the real story isn't science caught him. The real story is the system was learning in real time, and sometimes learning the hard way. Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death, later receiving additional convictions including for Kimberly Leach. But even then, he didn't stop trying to bargain and manipulate. Bundy spent years on death row, appeals, delays, legal manoeuvring. He kept trying to control the narrative. Even marrying Carol Boone in court was part of the performance, a way to look human, stable, normal, anything but what the evidence showed. But when the execution date closed in and options ran out, something shifted. Bundy began to talk. Confessions, details, locations, often detached, often clinical, sometimes framed as if the killer was a separate force inside him. He admitted to 30 murders, though investigators have long suspected the true number could be higher. And yet, even here, at the end, there was no clean closure, because information isn't the same as accountability, and confession isn't the same as remorse. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. For some, it felt like an ending. For the families, it was never going to be that simple. If you're finding this documentary valuable, subscribe so you don't miss another episode of Evil Uncovered. We focus on the facts, the patterns, and the human cost, without glorifying the perpetrators. Bundy's case reshaped law enforcement culture in a few ways. It exposed how dangerous poor coordination can be when crimes cross borders. It highlighted security failures, how procedures can become a vulnerability. And it also became a cautionary tale in forensic storytelling. Persuasive evidence is not always the same as scientifically secure evidence. But the most important legacy isn't procedural, it's personal. Because the Bundy story didn't happen to Bundy, it happened to the people he stole from. So when we say their names, we're not reciting a list. We're doing the bare minimum history demands. We're acknowledging that each person was real, loved, missed, and irreplaceable. And if this documentary leaves you with anything, let it be this. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it asks for help, sometimes it seems normal, sometimes it blends in. And that's why we don't remember this case for the killer's performance. We remember it for the lives that should still be here. This has been Evil Uncovered.